Eastern Airlines Flight 401, crashed into the Florida Everglades in December 1972. The aircraft was traveling from New York to Miami. The flight crew had become fixated on a faulty indication in the cockpit. They had not realized that the autopilot was disconnected and they lost altitude and crashed. Luckily 75 people survived, although 101 souls died including Captain Robert Loft, Bob, and flight engineer Donald Repo, Don. Days later, the aircraft was retrieved and some parts salvaged, including a galley. Parts were used again on the Eastern Airlines fleet. It was after this that sightings started of both Bob and Don, standing in the aisle, cockpit, and galley. The vice president of Eastern Airlines boarded his flight from New York and chatted with a pilot, whom he assumed was the pilot of this flight. Later, he recognized that the pilot he'd been speaking to was, in fact, Bob. Another time, the captain was asked to check on a passenger in first class who was in pilot's uniform. The senior flight attendant said he was dazed and unresponsive when spoken to and was not on the passenger list. The captain recognized him as Bob. A flight attendant on a New York to Miami flight opened an overhead locker to find Bob's face peering out at her. On another flight, a flight attendant saw Don's face on the oven door. She called two crew in to witness what she had seen. He then said, "Watch out for fire in this plane." On the returning flight, the engine failed and had to be shut down, before catching fire. On returning to the galley, another flight attendant saw an engineer fixing the oven. She asked the flight engineer later about the oven, and he said he hadn't fixed it, and it didn't need to be fixed. She later picked from some photos Don to be the engineer she had seen. One day, the crew were in the cockpit discussing engineering when they discovered Don was sitting with them. He warned them of a faulty electrical circuit, which was then found and replaced. Bob was seen doing his pre-flight checks of the aircraft and told the ground staff it was all okay as he'd already completed the checks. The pilot was unnerved by what had happened and cancelled the flight. Whilst in the cockpit one day, preparing for the flight, the pilot heard loud knocks from under the floor beneath him. He opened the trap door to see Don looking at him, who then promptly disappeared. He wanted to look further and found a problem that could have caused a serious accident. The sightings were reported in a Flight Safety Foundation publication. Eastern Airlines CEO dismissed the claims, and crew were warned not to talk about the sightings. The crew had previously been encouraged to report every incident pertaining to the flight in the aircraft log books and many sightings were recorded. Mysteriously, the log books started to go missing from the aircraft. Eventually, all of the salvaged parts were removed from aircraft, and neither Bob nor Don were ever seen again. Truth or scare, we'll probably never know.